Reached after, I think, very fruitful discussions, the last session, where we are supposed to discuss with people who are more closely to the real thing, not only to theory, but also to practice. And first of all, I would like to ask Mr. Emmanuel Vlachogiannis. He is the Vice President of the Thessaloniki Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He is the host here. He has been here since morning, and we thank him very much for that. I think, Mr. Vlachogiannis, your presence, but also your interventions were very good, very to the point, and very enlightening. So now you have the floor for 10 minutes to issue whatever issues you want to raise.
Thank you. I stayed all the day because I found the issues and the topics of the conference very interesting, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to hear all the things, and because it is, I think, one of my duties to reflect on what was said before from, let's say, more practical point of view, but I'm afraid I will also miss the point to be very, very concentrated on practical points of view. First of all, I'd like to share with you my appreciation for Isaiah Berlin, and I fully embrace his methodology. His methodology is about the hedgehog and the fox. It is based on a very old Greek saying. The hedgehog is an animal that knows one thing, but the fox knows many things. And what is the message of his essay is that we have not to rely too much on monocausalities. It's better to combine a lot of possible inputs rather than to concentrate on only one main reason and to ask for that in the research. Having said that, I turn to my attention to the first problem which was raised this morning. Why failure of the Greek adjustment program? This is also, from my point of view, something that cannot be explained only by asking for one cause. But put it very bluntly, the Greek growth in the beginning of the first decade of the 21st century was the expression of a bubble, the real expression of a bubble, as we have seen it in the financial bubbles in the United States. There was, from Mr. Professor Liagorovas, said that there was a failure of forecasting. Yes, when we try to make forecasts and to assess in advance future developments, we have the risk to fail. And we have to learn how to separate the signal from the different noises around. And that is an art. And this kind of art is something that is asking for much effort. But there is also another reason for that. I think the theory behind the forecasting is not quite well fit for explaining complex situation in modern times. Very often we lack the microeconomic fundamentals. So when we formulate macro theory and macro policies, too often we think that processes are very linear and not convex or concave, and that adjustments of economies may be convex or concave, and that is something that cannot be properly be forecasted. We underestimate very, very often and with severe consequences what does it mean to have debts. Even in Keynesian theory, we have a lot the word of deficits and of the deficit stimulating macroeconomic activities, but Keynesian theory do not pay enough weight on debt. What happens if debt is accumulating from period to period? Is it something that is a negative, has a negative impact on deficit spending, or is it neutral? And the fourth reason is that demand management in an open economies like ours is quite infeasible, and explicitly is not feasible in economies they have a lack of competitiveness. When you try to stimulate the economy in a non-competitive environment by demand management, by increasing the demand for products and services, you also can create a lot of these imbalances in foreign trade. And that was one of the observations made in Greece during 2007 and 2008. We had a very huge public deficit and very huge imbalance in trade. These two deficits are going together because of the lack of competitiveness of the Greek economy. The real problem behind is the lack of competitiveness. Then, of course, there was a failure of implementation, not only in terms of political will, but very often in terms of technical issues. The people and the agencies striving to implement this adjustment program had not the capacity to do that. They lack the understanding of using different instruments of adjustment, and that proved to be a very deep and very, very burdening problem on the success of the adjustment. And of course, least but not least, there was also a failure of adequate political support, and it still is for that, as opinion leaders try to convey the message that other solutions, not very effortful, can be found, that management of demand can be feasible, that structural reforms are not needed, etc. And that shaped also the expectations. One very, very important factor that has been raised by Professor Liargovas. The expectation in this case of the Greek adjustment were from the beginning very negative ones, not positive. No one in the society was convinced that by applying this very thoughtful adjustment program would succeed in revitalizing the Greek economy. And probably, and I suspect this is a recurrent ideology in the Greek society. It's a strong belief in the myth of state, and that finds its expression in many, many different cases. But that's enough for Greece. Greece is a case of Europe, and of course there is a crisis in Europe, but it is not primarily a financial one. It is more an economic one, an economic crisis that has its roots in and the drop of competitiveness of Europe for many, many reasons, not only for the aging of population in Europe, not only for the extension of the welfare state or of the lack of innovation or of the lack of integration or limited integration of the European market, but there are so many, many reasons behind. I like to quote three numbers. Europe has 7% of the world population, 25% of world GDP, but 50% of the social expenditures, and that is, with the words of Niall Ferguson, something that is comparable to a very strong and stark war effort. It's very, very stark, a very, very strong argument, but he compared the burdens of welfare state with the burdens of war. And so we need to find out how to finance this burden, or we need to find out how we can find ways to reduce this burden. And that is something that is, I think, compelling, as European population is aging very, very fast, and almost by the year 2030, 30% of the population of Europe will be over 65 years, and that is something to be concerned about. Now, at a more narrow point, what is the contribution of businesses, how we can stimulate business, and it is very wise to make a distinction between business and corporation. In Greek, doesn't mean too much, but in English notations, it means a lot. Well, we have seen in the past 200 years in world history a formation of big corporations, and big corporations were, let's say, the carrying ships for modernization and for the improvement of life conditions in the world, at least in Europe and in North America. But I go back to a very seminal work done by Ronald Coase in 1937, who touched the question of the corporation itself. Why are corporations be built in a market economy? In the classical sense, there are not corporations as agents in markets. They are producers and they are consumers. They are investors, they are consumers and the savers, but not corporations. Corporations is an organization with a form of hierarchy. It's more similar to a state than to a market organization, with the distinction that corporations have and that is the reason behind of my question before when I asked Georgina for this very complex issue of principal-agent problem and with the governments of modern corporations. Corporations have profit as overarching goal, and the state has a lot of goals together, and state has also the capacity to enforce. Corporation must sell. But corporations are not very clearly embedded in the process of markets, and we cannot see it very often, but when it comes to a disruptive change, then we see some powers diverging from this equilibrium, and these powers are induced by the revolution in technologies of ICT. We have internet, that enables the communication. We have the Internet of Things, enables the communication between machines, between devices, and between appliances. We will have also an Internet of Energy, which will make the possibility of extensive use of renewable energies a real option than it is today. We have also an evolution, a revolutionary evolution in 3D printing that is also transforming consumers to a new kind of entities, the so-called prosumers, between production and consumption. We have the automation in big fabrics, and the process of automation makes a lot of workers obsolete and also changes the pattern of governance in these entities. And even in the field of linguistics, we have also some very interesting evolution with the creation of new words. The words we use today are not very compelling in order to describe realities of starting today and being a common place in the next 20 years. And these realities will depend on the abilities of commanding the production from a distance. This is not anymore manufacturing, this is infofacturing. We needing the fourth, information and facturing and bringing together. But what does it mean, all of this, all this evolution? It means that, and applying the concept of Ronald Coase on transactional cost, the very existence of big corporation is put under question. And of course it also means that some other possible evolutions are ahead of us. For instance, that a lot of products and services can be produced and at marginal costs that are very, very close to zero. That means a different perception of markets, and markets will adjust to that fact. Needless to say that nothing can be forecasted with some clarity. We see scenarios, we can make sometimes choices between scenarios that have a dynamic character, so this fact will have a positive or a negative loop and another fact, and all of this is very difficult to imagine. But anyhow, we can have an advice. This advice is that we have to create a positive, and we have to maintain a positive environment for businesses, for all kinds of businesses, be it private ones, or social entrepreneurs, or businesses of different other, of commons, as Rifkin says. And there are two very important drivers for that. And these important drivers can be located in the United States. And there are evolutions that sound very strange in Europe, but they have flourished within an environment that is very favorable for businesses. The managerless company, for instance. One example is Valve company. Valve, where Finance Minister Mr. Varoufakis has been for years economist in residence. And the other one is the so-called emergence of freelance economy, an economy which is based not on the very classical labor relations, employee-employer, but there are economies where people are cooperating in the form of projects for, let's say, a limited time, and then they dissolve and they unite again in other projects, etc. It is something that in the United States has attracted some 20% of the workforce, and that is an indication how things can develop in Europe, and we have to be prepared for that. I think I was too much academic on that field, but I don't know if I have met your expectations. But indeed, by choosing the title "Stimulating Business in a Europe of Crisis" is a very, very thoughtful decision. Businesses should be the drivers for economic development. We cannot leave it to state and to hierarchies, and businesses live on the entrepreneurial spirit. And any business starts from an entrepreneur. It has its core, it's an entrepreneurial spirit. And this is something that has flourished in Europe and should again flourish in the years to come. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Mr. Vlachogiannis. Now I would like to ask Ms. Liana Huta to take the floor. She is the President of Women Managers and Entrepreneurs of the Macedonia Department. Ms. Huta, the floor. Can you switch on the micro, you know?
No, that's fine, thank you. Let me open my presentation. I think I have a problem here with my presentation. Let us try again the speed.
We copied the shortcut and not the real thing. Sorry.
So thank you very much. First of all, let me start from this by thanking the organizing committee for the honor of inviting me in this conference with this so very challenging title. And after the so interesting speeches we've heard so far, and just before starting the plenary discussion, I will put some more points on the women's dimension and how this could stimulate business in a Europe in crisis. And I'm very happy that we had some speeches before in the previous session on women's empowerment and women's participation in economy. As Lina introduced me, well, I'm the president of Women Managers and Entrepreneurs in Macedonia sector of Hellenic Management Association. And in real life, my background is that I'm a chemical engineer, and I've been working for many, many years in industry. And right now, I'm the International Government Affairs Director of Hellenic Petroleum Group of Companies. So, starting with our discussion, no one can deny that in crisis or not, the most wanted parameter for all business in Western economies is human talent. Numbers and facts show us that in 2015, and for the last years, Europe faces a talent drain and perhaps hasn't realized it yet, or even hasn't properly reacted yet. And what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the women's talent drain. And I would like to ask you, how many of us here in this room have realized that 60% of the European and Greek university graduates are female and just 40% male? That makes us 50% more women than men, highly educated, and available in entering and stimulated economy. On the other hand, or I would rather say on the dark side of the moon, when we come to real life and real economy, highly educated women start vanishing. They vanish from decision-making positions, from high career levels, from boards. And this is certainly a talent drain. In European companies, women hold just the 2.4% of the board seats, instead of the 97.6% of the male board members. This is perhaps the most stunning number in a Europe that wants to be proud for its democracy, for its equal opportunities, for its civilization, for its human talent resources, for its competitiveness. But this stunning number in board seats is not the only one, I'm afraid. It is just the most indicative one. Less women in entrepreneurship, less women in politics, less women in academics. The more we ascend in high-level decision-making positions, the less women we find. Is it because they can't do it? This is not true. Bright, skilled, successful women have reached the top of all sectors, in politics, law, finance, science, high technology, business. And let me point out here that among the 50 top women in business, that means CEOs and presidents, the 31% of them are CEO and presidents in technology giant companies, such as Hewlett-Packard, IBM, General Motors, Procter & Gamble, DuPont, Google, Yahoo, Facebook. So women proved that they can do it in every sector. They are highly educated, they are determined, they are committed, they are effective. But they are still very few. They are still the exception to the male rule. And I'm afraid they still constitute the one-digit statistic that is less than 10%, as I already mentioned, for example, for the European board seats. And since this conference focuses on Europe in crisis, it is important to mention that EU not only believes that less women in economy shows lack of democracy and lack of civilization, but most of all, it constitutes a financial drain. EU believes that more women need to be part of the workforce in order to get Europe's economic engine moving again, especially today with all kinds of crises we are facing. So it has been estimated that by fostering women in European economy, EU could benefit by an increase of 13% of the GDP. And that was the reason for the strategy for equality between women and men that EU adopted for the years 2010-2015. But apart from the EU studies, there are other important studies like the one carried out by Nick Wilson, professor in the business school at the University of Leeds. In his study, Professor Wilson examined 17,000 British companies that wound up in 2008, showing that companies with a highly feminized management seem to have been better prepared and protected against financial crisis. A larger proportion of female managers appears to balance the risk-taking behavior of their male colleagues. And finally, having at least one female director on the board could reduce a company's chances of going bankrupt by about 20%. That is why Professor Wilson brightly underlined that high heels means low risk, and that women on board is not just the right thing, it is the bright thing, especially in periods of crisis, or rather in order to prevent crisis. But since we are talking about economy, apart from the big companies with thousands or hundreds of employees, let us take a look at the entrepreneurship environment as well. I will refer to one of the best reference points on entrepreneurship in Greece, the annual overview on entrepreneurship published by the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, the very well-known to all Greek people here, IOVE. The study that was published in 2014 focused especially on women entrepreneurship, and the findings are extremely interesting for our discussion. During the last years, in a few minutes, during the last years, and the national interest in policy making is recording concerning female entrepreneurship. Because according to statistics in all Western countries, entrepreneurship is a male affair, since less women become entrepreneurs, but the main observation doesn't have to do with quantity, but with extremely important quality characteristics. According to the European Commission statistics, not only the 59% of university graduates are female, as I mentioned before, but also the 61% of PhD degree holders are female as well. The fact that this highly qualified population is not encouraged entering entrepreneurship according to their knowledge and experience means that startup business quality is lower than what it could be, IOVE study concludes. It is very interesting to focus on the Greek case figures. Let us see the quantitative figures. It is true that among start-uppers, we find one woman for every 2 men, or otherwise only 4.4% of total female population becomes a start-upper versus 8.6% of male population, that is a double score for men, while most of the women start a business not on an opportunity case, but mainly on a need base. Similar findings for the established business. 10% of the female population belongs to the established business women versus 20%, almost 20% of the male population recognized as established businessmen. A difference that has widened in the years of economic crisis. That is the reason for the slight difference in the numbers. But although we find less women in entrepreneurship, as it happens in all European countries, women entrepreneurs outweigh in 3 extremely important quality characteristics: innovation, technology level, and job creation perspectives. What about Greece and those characteristics? Let us see the numbers. More women entrepreneurs hold a postgraduate and a PhD degree, as I mentioned before, but these numbers refer to the entrepreneurs, women and male, comparing women and men. More women entrepreneurs belong to the higher family income category, while more men belong to the lower family income category. More women entrepreneurs make use of new technologies in their production process. More women entrepreneurs offer a completely new product or service in their clients. Women entrepreneurs face, therefore, lower competition intensity, something that fully complies with their trend in new products and in new and high technologies. They also run more companies with highly export orientation. And finally, they expect to create more jobs in the next 5 years. So the conclusion from all these numbers and all those qualitative comments is, from this very important study of IOVE, is that women appear more likely to develop new markets. And this finding strengthens the argument for the empowerment of women entrepreneurs and should be taken into account by policymakers, as IOVE underlines. I would conclude by saying that we all, men and women, have to take into account the above findings and observations and arguments in all our decisions, in our goals, in our perceptions, in our mindsets. Most important of all, I would say, this last one. We should overcome our mindsets established not only during the last years, but through the decades and through the centuries, I'm afraid. Nowadays, during the crisis we've been through in Southern Europe mostly, and even more in Greece, our economy, our business, our society cannot afford wasting human resources, cannot afford wasting human talent and high-skilled capacities. Our 60% of university graduates in Europe and our 61% of PhD holders should not be left apart, should not be left underemployed, and should not be downsized in their careers. Giving the opportunity to this female population to deploy their skills and capacities in real life and real economy. As we said, it's not the right thing, it's the right thing in order to stimulate business in a European crisis. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Ms. Huta. And now the floor is yours, Ms. Miriam Liapi. Let me help you with a PowerPoint.
Hello? Okay. Hi, my name is Miriam, and as said before, I'm the entrepreneur Liana was talking about. I'm here to bring you proof that when people collaborate, great things can happen. I will present you Bioscope, a social consumer cooperative, and its a short story. But before I do that, I would like to mention something. I strongly believe that enterprises, Greek enterprises, should collaborate in order to survive and be competitive. I would all invite you to remember Darwin's theory, evolution theory. My experience indicates that this theory applies to business as well. Greek enterprises, let's remember the theory. It says it's not the strong who survives, it's not the cleverest who survives. Him who survives is the one who adapts. And this is my point. Greek enterprises, I strongly believe, should adopt to a new environment, adopt to new technologies and practices, And to do that in a lower cost, they should collaborate. This is my proposal today. This is what I have to testify. Let's go to Bioscope and its short story. It will be 7 minutes. I know it's the end of the conference. Well, I did it. Let's start. How it all started? It started between friends. We were discussing, it was around 2010-11 in the burst of the Greek crisis, and we were discussing what are we going to do with mediators. It was happening something very awkward. Products with a price, let's say, of 40 cents from the farmer ended up in the consumer with a 50%, 100% profit, sometimes 2,000% profit. We had a great problem with mediators, and the idea was to do something to stop this greed. So the idea was to make our own supermarket and control our food. Okay. The idea was spread between friends, relatives, and finally, in 2011, we managed to meet. This is our first Constitutional Assembly. We met 114 members, and we established our cooperative, but only the cooperative, not the supermarket. To establish a supermarket, we had to take several decisions. We had great concerns and hesitations, and especially for the environment, the pastel environment, as we say in business, political, economical, tax environment. And apart of that, we had a ruthless competition, supermarket, big chain supermarket competition. So our first aim was to become 1,000 members, but we were seeing that this was not happening. This was not possible. So we readjust our goals. We decided that it's enough to be 300 members to establish a supermarket, and we took the big step. We decided in July 2013 to create our first supermarket in our General Assembly, and we did. The news spread fast. Here you see pictures of members of the community, of the cooperative, offering themselves voluntary. This was something amazing for the seemingly prevailing atmosphere of apathy at this period. And this is our first supermarket, a bit smaller than we first imagined it, but this is our supermarket. Let me tell you that today we have 8 employees, paid employees. We've created 8 jobs, and we have 160 members, not 20, as you will see later. And most of all, we have 50 active members of our cooperative, mostly professors, university professors, working in 18 committees, trying to make sure that everything works fine. This is the idea of our products. We've managed 1.5 years after to have 84% of our products without mediators, straight from farmers, producers, women cooperatives, and we are very excited about that. We hope we make it 100. I think our competitive advantage is our quality standards. It happens something amazing here. As you can see, we have a committee, a quality committee, and this committee makes sure that each product placed in our shelves, in the supermarket shelves, is a product that doesn't have forbidden chemicals and microorganisms, genetically modified organisms, unsafe substances for the human body, ingredients that harm the environment. And how do we make that? How do we manage that? Which tools we use? The tools we use is, first of all, and most important, I think, the Hellenic authority, food authority, we call it here in Greece, EOF. Their fines, they're placed in several products that don't meet criteria. We also collaborate with the laboratory, with the University of Ioannina, and conduct laboratory controls. We follow World Health Organization instructions. We read independent institution papers and any academic work regarding food and safety. And of course, we read label ingredients, right? In the committee, there are 5 chemists, and George is, he's in the University of Aristotelios. I can't remember. He's an academic anyway. This is the end of my presentation, and this is the final picture. It's not 420 members, it's 460 members now. We were happy to see 220 mass media talking about Bioscope. We had foreign media writing for Bioscope. 2 documentary films used Bioscope as a good example of social economy. And in our page, we had 110,000 visits. I think the most important, what proves that we did well, is this. It's our sales for 2014, and I'm happy to say that a few days ago we had our General Assembly for 2015. As you see, there was always an upgoing trend, a revenue trend, but in 2015 we exceeded our goals, and people around Thessaloniki and outside Thessaloniki visit us and shop from our shop, not just because we are cheap or we have good quality, but mainly because of the idea. Okay, thank you.
We thank you very much, Ms. Liapi, as well. I think we have a lot of food. Well, I mean food for thought and for discussion before we go to the real food. So the floor is now open for you, for everybody who would like to make a comment or to pose a question to our speakers, or to state your own experience from entrepreneurship in Greece or abroad, the problems, your ideas. So, please. Yes, Beate.
Thank you very much. Being speakers on the last session, especially this late in the afternoon, can be very challenging. And I found myself more awake now than I felt during the break, and that's a big compliment to the all 3 presentations. I think one of the most important challenges that we have ahead of us is how to break the stranglehold that financial markets have on the real economy. and listening to your presentation from the Chamber of Commerce, I feel that if your insights and reflections are representative for how leaders of chambers of commerce are thinking around Europe, then there's hope. I also want to say that the empowerment of women, of course, is very important. There's a lot that could be said and discussed about that, but I just want to say that it's very important that, as we saw also in this last presentation, that this is used for change, that is not used to get back on the track of business as usual, that we try to break away also from the stranglehold of path dependency, where it feels much safer to do things in the same way. So it was very encouraging to see those numbers where it shows that female entrepreneurs, that they often come up with new ideas. I read recently about this success story from Ethiopia, where a female entrepreneur has built up this shoe business, recycling used tires from cars, to combining that for the soles of the shoes, and then with a local traditional creation of weaving of materials to create this brand of shoes that is becoming popular all over the world. So it's possible to, but it really requires new ways of thinking, of thinking outside the box, and I think we've heard very encouraging examples of that. So thank you very much, all three of you.
Anybody else? Georgina.
Yes, equally like Beata, I'm very much inspired by your talks. I'm very impressed that there is so much movement towards a positive direction in Greece, which I think isn't portrayed at all, if I may say, in the media. So I think this is a unique opportunity to show exactly what certain people are able to contribute to the economy through different ways and means. My contribution here in this panel would be to encourage you maybe to share a little bit more about the problems. So I really appreciate the positive touch to your presentations, but I would encourage you maybe to share a few of the problems that the broader audience, maybe not in Greece, but others that are abroad, may need to be aware of when doing business in Greece. So, back to you.
Maybe we hold this question, and if there is no more question, then I'll come back. Not now. Maybe if there are more questions, we'll gather all of them. Maybe not, but we'll see. Yes, please. Yes, Anas.
I just want to compliment you with your very interesting presentations. Very impressive, all the data that you collected on the female participation in the economy and in society in general. And also very impressed by the social entrepreneurial evidence that you showed us. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course, Beata.
Yes. Sorry, I forgot. I also had one specific question, because this issue of women on boards, it's very interesting and very difficult to do empirical work on, because it's a question whether companies that have women on boards, are they good companies because of the women on boards, or are there women there because they are good companies? So I wondered whether we could hear any more about the study and whether that was discussed in that study. Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Anybody else? No. Okay, then if not, then I first pass the floor to Mahi. No? You want to be the last one? Okay, then I'll start from the beginning again. Mr. Vlachogiannis, you have the floor.
In short, business environment in Greece is not friendly enough. There are many reasons for that, not only one. Mainly, there is a general perception that businesses should be an extension of state activity, an extension of a state activity that was given as a privilege to the private people. And that makes very clear the point that when you try to establish a business, a lot of requirements regarding your obligations towards the state have to be met in advance. Number one. Second, there is to some extent in very limited possibility of companies to look after external finance, credit. The banking system is a very conservative one. And nowadays we cannot speak about banking system providing any type of liquidity, since the banking system in fact is at the edge to collapse. For years, and not only for the last years, but if someone makes a record on the Greek business history, then he will find out that for years the main purpose of banking was to be the financier of the state. So as the Greek state collapsed in 2012 or had to adjust its debt, a lot of the banking system became under stress, and in fact from almost 20 banks operating by the end of 1990-2000, there are 4.5 banks now operating. 4 big banks, so-called systemic banks, and then one smaller, which is not so much affected by the involvement of state. And that is something that has contributed to a less competition between in the financial sector itself. That makes the environment for businesses, of course, not more friendly, more hostile. And Greek businesses have not found yet the way to other forms of finance. It's something that will take a lot of time, as the businesses ourselves are very conservative in terms of financing. Opportunities are there, but what is very important is to create trust between the lender and the recipient. And by the abundance of the negative news,